Welcome, traveler of the forgotten paths. Gather close to the light, for the tale we unveil tonight is not one of gentle starlight, but of shadow, fire, and a courage that burned brighter than any flame. We turn the pages back to the First Age, to the chronicles of Beleriand, and to the story of a king who dared to challenge darkness itself at its very gates. For 400 years of the sun, a semblance of peace lay upon the northern lands of Beleriand. It was a guarded peace, a tense quiet known as the Siege of Angband. The Noldor, the High Elves who had returned from Valinor, had contained the power of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, within his mountain fortress. Their gleaming encampments formed a chain across the land, a vigilant watch against the evil that slumbered beneath the earth. In this long age, a generation had been born that knew no home but Middle-earth. The memory of the war that had brought them here had faded into legend. They grew proud, believing their strength and vigilance were enough to keep the shadow at bay forever. They held tourneys and feasts, composed songs of their valor, and the lands they ruled grew fair and strong. They had forgotten the true nature of the enemy they faced. But deep in the unfathomed pits of Angband, the Dark Lord was not idle. He did not sleep. For 4 centuries his hatred festered, and his power grew. He forged new weapons of terror, and bred monstrous creatures in the subterranean fires, twisting life into new and horrific shapes. He was a master of deceit, and the long peace was his greatest deception. Then, on a cold winter's night, without warning, the deception ended. The Dagor Bragollach, the battle of sudden flame, began. The peaks of the Iron Mountains erupted, spewing forth rivers of fire that raced across the green plain of Ardgalen, faster than any horse could run. The grass, the trees, the very soil, were consumed in an instant. The once beautiful plain was reborn in fire and death, its name forever changed to Anfoglith, the gasping dust. The elven armies guarding the siege were caught completely off guard. Many were burned alive in their encampments before they could even draw their swords. The northern lands were plunged into a darkness, lit only by the fires of Morgoth's wrath. And with the fire came the beasts. Leading the assault was Glaurung the Golden, father of dragons, his presence a living embodiment of terror. Behind him marched legions of Balrogs, their forms cloaked in shadow and flame, their whips cracking like thunder. And behind them, an ocean of orcs, a tide of black hatred that swarmed over the scorched earth. The Siege of Angband was not just broken, it was annihilated. The lines of the Noldor shattered. The sons of Feanor were driven back with heavy losses. In the east, the fortress of Aglon was breached. In the west, the sons of Finarfin, Angrod and Egnor, were slain, their small realm utterly destroyed by the fiery tide. The news that spread across Beleriand was of nothing but ruin, death, and overwhelming defeat. Word of this catastrophe reached Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, in his northern realm of Hithlum. He saw the smoke of the burning lands on the horizon, and heard the scattered, terrified reports from survivors. He learned of the fall of his kinsmen, the ruin of their realms, and the seemingly unstoppable advance of Morgoth's forces. It seemed to him that the final ruin of the Noldor was at hand, that all their courage and all their sacrifices had been for nothing. A great despair fell upon him, so heavy and dark that it felt like a physical weight. But within that despair, a new fire was kindled. It was not the fire of hope, but the white-hot flame of pure, unyielding wrath. He believed all was lost. In that moment of ultimate darkness, he was filled with a fury and a recklessness that cast out all fear. He would not sit and wait for the end. He would not allow the Dark Lord to claim a slow, grinding victory. If this was to be the end, he would make it an end worthy of a song. He clad himself in his finest war gear. His armor shone like forgotten stars, and his shield, mirrored and set with crystals, blazed with a blue light. He took up his helm, which was crowned with a wreath of diamonds, and its crest was a plume of white feathers that rose high above his head. In his hand he grasped his sword, Ringil, whose blade glittered with a pale fire, like ice in the light of the moon. Thus arrayed, Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, looked less like a mortal king and more like one of the Valar, the angelic powers of the West. He went to his stables and mounted his great steed, Rochalar. Without a word to his captains, without a backward glance at the people he was leaving behind, he spurred his horse and rode forth from the gates of Hithlum alone. Those who saw him pass were filled with awe and terror, for such was the fury of his charge and the light that shone from his eyes that they cried aloud, believing that Orm himself, the great huntsman of the Valar, had come from the west to aid them. He rode with a speed and fury that no orc could withstand. The dust of his passage rose like a storm cloud behind him as he crossed the blighted plains. He did not stop, he did not slow. His path was a straight line, aimed directly at the heart of the enemy's domain. He passed through all of Morgoth's armies, and they fled from him, for they mistook his wrath for the coming of a god. At last he came to the very gates of Angband. The fortress was a monument to despair, a place of dread and shadow that poisoned the very air around it. But Fingolfin was beyond fear. He reined in Roshalor before the silent, terrible gates and drew forth a great silver horn. He put the horn to his lips and blew a blast so clear and piercing that it echoed deep within the stone halls of Angband. It was a sound of pure defiance, a note of elven valor that had no place in that realm of hate. Then he hammered upon the vast iron gates with the hilt of his sword. Deep within his fortress, Morgoth heard the challenge. He heard the clear note of the horn and the ringing of steel on his gates. He heard the single voice that rose in the blasted wasteland, naming him lord of slaves and coward, daring him to come forth and face one-on-one combat. Now it is said that Morgoth was the only one of the Valar to have ever known fear. He was a being of immense power, but he was a craven at heart. He had no desire to face the white fire of the Elven King's wrath. He would have preferred to remain in his deep throne room, sending forth his minions to do his bidding. But the challenge had been heard by all his captains. He had been named a coward before his own servants. His pride, the very foundation of his being, would not allow him to refuse. So, with slow, heavy steps that shook the foundations of the mountains, Morgoth arose and prepared for battle. He was coming. The gates of Angband groaned open. Fingolfin, alone on the desolate plain, watched as the Dark Lord himself emerged. Morgoth came forth clad in black armor, a terrifying mountain of a being. Upon his head was an iron crown, in which the 3 stolen Silmarils, the hallowed jewels of the Elves, burned with a cold, captive light. He carried a great black shield, unmarked by any device, that cast a shadow of death before it. In his hand he wielded Grond, the hammer of the underworld, a weapon of such malevolence that its every strike landed with the force of a thunderbolt. The duel was to begin. As Morgoth advanced, Fingolfin was a thing of pure light and motion. He was like a star leaping into life against a backdrop of utter night. He wheeled Roshalor away from Morgoth's first lumbering attacks, his sword Ringil gleaming like a shard of ice. Morgoth swung Grond, and the hammer fell with a sound that split the air. But Fingolfin was too swift. The hammer missed, and instead smote the ground, leaving a vast, smoking pit from which fumes and fire arose. Again and again Morgoth swung his terrible weapon, and each time Fingolfin would evade the blow, the ground around them becoming a broken field of craters and chasms. And as the Dark Lord tired from his own efforts, the Elven King would leap in, quick as lightning, and wound him with Ringil. 7 times Fingolfin wounded the Dark Lord, and 7 times Morgoth cried out in a voice of such anguish and rage that it sent shudders through his armies cowering on the peaks of the Eard Engren. The sound of his pain was a small, bitter victory for the free peoples of Middle-earth. But the battle was long, and the king began to tire. The immense power of Morgoth was a draining aura, and the ground was broken and treacherous. The Dark Lord saw his opponent's weariness and pressed his advantage, his hammer blows becoming a relentless storm of destruction. Fingolfin, stepping back to avoid a strike, stumbled into one of the very pits that Grond had forged. For a fleeting moment he was vulnerable, and in that moment Morgoth brought all his weight to bear. The Dark Lord lunged forward and set his great iron-shod foot upon Fingolfin's neck. The weight was like a fallen mountain. The High King was pinned, his back broken, his life crushed out of him. The light of the Noldor was being extinguished under the heel of darkness. But even as death took him, with his last, desperate stroke of defiance, Fingolfin hewed at the foot that held him down. He drove the full length of his sword, Ringil, deep into Morgoth's flesh. The king was slain, but he had left his mark. The pain was beyond anything Morgoth had ever known. His cry was a shriek that echoed to the deepest dungeons of Angband and across the whole of the Northlands. He raised his foot, and the venomous black blood poured forth, filling the crater where Fingolfin lay. In his agony and rage, Morgoth took the broken body of the Elven King and would have cast it to his wolves to be devoured. But his victory was not to be so absolute. From the high peaks of the Crissaegrim, a cry answered Morgoth's. Thoron Basador, king of the eagles, mightiest of all birds that have ever been, came swooping down like a storm from the sky. He had been sent by Manwë himself to watch over the children of Middle-earth. Thorondor stooped upon Morgoth, and with his great talons he marred the Dark Lord's face, a wound that would also never truly heal. Before Morgoth could react, the great eagle snatched up the body of the fallen king and soared away, bearing him out of the reach of his enemy. He carried the king's body south, over the hidden valley of Tumladen, to the secret city of Gondolin. There, on a mountaintop overlooking the hidden city, Fingolfin's son, Turgon, came and built a great cairn of stones over his father. And so ended Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, the most proud and valiant of all the Elven kings of old. No orc ever dared to pass that high place, nor profane the tomb of the king who had faced their master alone. But the legacy of his duel lived on. From that day forward, Morgoth walked with a limp. The pain of the wound dealt by Ringil never left him, a constant, burning reminder that even in the face of absolute despair, a single act of courage could leave a permanent scar upon evil itself. His victory was forever tainted by the memory of the king who fell at his feet, yet wounded him to the core. The echoes of that defiant horn still ring through the ages, a testament to the fact that even when all hope seems lost, honor is not. If this chronicle of courage against impossible odds has stirred your spirit, honor its memory with a like, and subscribe to our Hall of Lore, so that we may uncover more of these forgotten tales together. Until our paths cross again, may your own light never falter in the dark.